So now that we've discussed how Life of Pi presents two different stories of the events that took place while Pi was aboard the lifeboat, we can start to see, well, we've seen the connections between the two stories, the two parallels, how both stories have parallel events, but one uses animals to depict those events, whereas the other one has human survivors in place of those animals. So we can start looking at the stories within the book as kind of an allegory. And if we look at the definition of an allegory refers to a story or any type of work. It could be, a piece of art, it could be a poem, another, any type of work, literary work, that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, and typically that hidden meaning has a kind of moral or political undertone to it. So you probably have come across allegory before. I often use the example of Animal Farm by George Orwell to explain allegory. So in Orwell's allegory, he uses animals as well, but he's using animals to represent kind of the events of the communist revolution in Russia and the kind of overthrow of the government by Russian revolutionaries, communists, as they took over power in Russia and then struggled within their organization to with dictatorship and sort of tension between different members. But Orwell was sort of using animals. He used farm animals taking over their farmers' land and the farm. And as the story goes on, animals become more human. They start walking on two legs. They are talking animals. So it becomes apparent that there's sort of a hidden meaning or hidden story within the story. That's our allegorical level. Allegory is often used in sort of science fiction as well, to sort of represent things in a kind of more abstract or symbolic way. So with Life of Pi, we do have allegory. So there's hidden meaning or hidden stories within the story that reveal certain things, certain pieces of wisdom or ideas about the character in this case, and about his reliance on religion, his spirituality, as well as about, I think, human nature as well is also implied. So the hidden meanings of Pi's story. So he's using animals in his first story. So we could view his narrative as a kind of animal allegory. So the animals are representing something beyond just being animals. They also become more symbolic in an allegorical reading of the novel. So if we look at animal allegory, the animals that Pi selects to represent himself, I guess, in the first story, he chooses a tiger, an orangutan, a hyena, and a zebra to represent the human survivors aboard his boat. So he's conveying certain things about his own nature and human nature, maybe in general, through the use of animals. So if you think about, the events that play out between Pi and Richard Parker, if we view them as the same being, the same character, so if we say Richard Parker and Pi are the same throughout, the role of Richard Parker in Pi's life becomes a little bit more revealing. So if Richard Parker just exists in Pi's mind, what does that say about Pi? So it might be a representation of his fierce will to live, his life instinct that is going to fight and struggle against any obstacles put in his path. Richard Parker also kind of represents that ferocity, that savagery that he has to kind of tap into in order to survive. Um, Richard Parker as a tiger is a fierce carnivore, a killer. They refer to Richard Parker as a man-eater over and over again. So all of those things kind of are playful reminders that Pi is this man-eater. Has to resort to carnivorism, predatoriness, and really tap into those animal instincts if he's going to survive this horrible experience. So the reality of that would be that Pi was alone this whole time on the life raft, and that he made up the story about the animals as a way to kind of cope with the horrible reality of what happened to him. So he had lost all his family aboard the Simsum when it sunk. So you can imagine that being alone in this situation on a life raft, he would have a lot of time on his hand to construct a very intricate, detailed story, this animal allegory. And it's a way of sort of coping with or masking the emotional toll of his traumatic events. And it's also a way of representing a part of himself, the survivor side, that would do anything it takes in order to survive. So it kind of represents his killer instinct or his life instinct. And the way that Richard Parker disappears very unceremoniously at the end of the novel, it could mark Pi's return to civilization. So he becomes more human again. And Richard Parker, that little piece of his mind, goes back into his memory, almost like a repressed memory. And then he still has nightmares about Richard Parker, even in the present of the novel. So it could suggest that Richard Parker is kind of like his repressed self, the part of himself that he doesn't like to acknowledge all the time. It's kind of like, I don't know if you guys have seen Fight Club, that movie. I don't want to spoil it for you, but there is like this hidden side of the character, the protagonist in that movie, and there is a sort of persona or imaginary friend that plays a role and represents the kind of inner drives, desires that are often repressed in human existence. So if we think just about ourselves, what do we repress about ourselves? You might repress traumatic memories. You might repress or hide certain things we don't like about ourselves, or things we have to control in our day-to-day lives. So our, hunger, our overwhelming greed, our selfishness, our ruthlessness, our anger, our passion, all those things we have to kind of keep controlled if we're going to participate in civilized society. But there is, if we think about human nature, there is a capacity for evil. Anybody is capable of doing something evil, doing something disgusting, doing something ruthless, selfish. You could become a killer in a certain situation, right? So there are events that could occur, circumstances in life where you become almost unrecognizable to yourself, either in desperation or out of necessity. And so for Pi, he kind of represents the evilness that he's capable of in Richard Parker. The ferocity that he has to survive is represented in Richard Parker. But if we think about the story allegorically, Richard Parker is just a dream, an imaginary friend, part of himself, kind of personified as an animal. So that's the revelation, is sort of, it reveals something about humanity and human nature, and about Pi's own capacity for evil, which is a human characteristic. Or not evil, let's say savagery or brutality as a synonym for evil. But there is kind of this line between humans and animals that can be crossed in the certain circumstances. So even you or I could be capable of, doing ruthless, horrible things if we were in the situation. On another level, the animal allegory, the first story, also represents or says something about Pi's strong belief system. So we've seen this whole time, he believes in God, he believes in a higher power, he believes humans need religion and have a strong sense of spirituality, and he believes strongly in the function and role of religion in giving somebody a good life, a better life. So through religion, you have a more meaningful existence in Pi's mind, and he sees the necessity of having faith in something. Even though you can't see or prove God exists, Pi's strong sense of faith carries him forward. It gives his life meaning, and it helps him cope with some of the difficult realities that he's faced. So the second hidden meaning of Pi's animal allegory is the religious connotations of his story. So there are certain things that suggest that Pi's story is all about taking a leap of faith, and he asks us as readers to follow his story, believe his story, and take that leap of faith to say that this story is a meaningful, a better story, essentially, than his horrible story about human brutality. So Pi's religious faith is very much evident in his animal allegory, and we'll look at that, how that plays a role in how the two Japanese ministers are asked, which is the better story. And if you remember from the beginning of the book, Pi, or the story is sort of promised to be one that will make you believe in God. So Pi's story is something that reaffirms our faith in things that are unprovable or unbelievable, but he asks us to suspend our reason, our rationality, and go with him on this journey, to have faith in the unknown. And there are certain things that he sees in that give human existence more meaning. So having faith, believing in things like love, in God, these are things that add to our human existence. They make life better. So if you believe in love, in unconditional love, if you believe in spirituality, that there's more to life than just, you know, once you die, there's an afterlife. Believing in that would make your life maybe worth living, or help you get through life obstacles or circumstances that are challenging. If you believed in a higher power, or if you believed in an afterlife, you wouldn't be so afraid of death. So he sees a real strong purpose and meaning to having religion or having faith in some higher, bigger spiritual reality. And he says that that's going to give us a better life if we believe in these things that we can't necessarily prove exist, but to have faith in them anyway. So Pai asks the two Japanese ministers which story is better, the one with the tiger or the one with just the human survivors. And they both agree that the better story is the one which is harder to believe, which is the animal story. That one's hard to believe because it's got such weird things that happen to Pai. It has him training a wild tiger. It has him going to this weird algae island that's populated by meerkats. It has him doing sort of weird things that we wouldn't imagine possible, or seeing things that we can't imagine are real. But So on one level, it's a very irrational, unbelievable story, but it's still the better story. It reaffirms our beliefs that the impossible is possible in some cases. The rational story, the one that seems more realistic, is a horrible story, a traumatizing story, and it reveals the worst about human nature. And Pi sort of he conveys it as being, you know, a story that is flat, that is realistic, that is what he calls dry, yeastless factuality. So the second story about the humans, with the cook being as brutal as he is, and with Pi resorting to murder and cannibalism, it reaffirms a reality that we are more used to seeing in the newspaper or in in news stories, or the worst about humanity is affirmed in that story. And it's more realistic in that sense, but it's not the better story because it doesn't make us think higher or dream bigger. It's a flat story, and it's kind of just affirms that life can be horrible and that humans are capable of very evil, selfish behaviors. So in a way, Pi is also bringing in the ideas of faith versus realism or rationality. So on the He's sort of saying, having faith is irrational because we can't prove it. It's hard to believe. But he asks us, on page 330, if you stumble at mere believability, what are you living for? Isn't love hard to believe? Love is hard to believe. Ask any lover. Life is hard to believe. Ask any scientist. God is hard to believe. Ask any believer. What is your problem with hard to believe? So he's compelling the reader to really make a leap of faith and believe in things that are hard to believe in. So love, life, God are things that are important to Pi, and make your life richer and better if you have those things in your life. If you didn't have love in your life, it would be a very difficult life to lead. It would be very sad, and you would be very lonely, and it would be a lot of suffering in your life, which is what happens to him in the second story, where he is traumatized and alone, and it's very difficult for him to get through that experience. Our realistic or rational minds will gravitate towards the more realistic story as being the true story, objectively true in that it represents the facts, the scientific sort of view of what would happen. But Pi says that's just one way of looking at it. It's a flat story, an immobile story. It doesn't make you a better person, or doesn't make you think higher or further or differently. It doesn't challenge your mind at all. It's just the brutal, cold, hard facts, nothing more. So when we're asked, which is the better story, most of us would say it's the story with Pi's relationship with Richard Parker and the animals aboard the ship. That one makes us think more about life and the possibilities that are out there that we can't see yet, or that we don't know exist yet, but asks us to make that kind of leap of faith. So he's really forcing readers to kind of pick sides in a way. So which story is true is a different question than which story is better. And he seems to really tell such a compelling story with the animals that we are gravitate towards that story more as being the better story. Pi will end up asking the two men which story they prefer, and they both agree that the story with the animals is the better story. Pi's comment, he replies, "Thank you, and so it goes with God." So That line is a little bit, mysterious. Why does Pi say the same, like, and so it goes with God at that point. But that's where you get the sort of allegorical level of his animal story. Because if you admit that the better story is the one with animals, you admit that life is better when there is a measure of faith in it, faith in the unbelievable. If you can suspend your sense of realism to embrace a story that challenges you, that makes you think differently, to think beyond the rational mind to something more, then that's what God does for people as well, for Pi. So God opens his mind to new ideas, new possibilities, and expands the mind further than just cold, hard facts or cold, harsh reality. So, in that way, Pi really suggests that religion, God, spirituality, whatever you want to call it, adds a lot to our lives, helps us cope with horrible things, and makes someone's life richer, better, more meaningful, and can be a really positive force for somebody. So that's how the story is supposed to make us believe in God. If you can suspend your mind enough to embrace Pi's first story as the better story, as the version of truth that appeals more to you, then you're also capable of being somebody maybe who has a more spiritual mindset, who can see that there's more to life than just cold, hard realities. So that's where we get the ending of the story. So you can sort of see both stories as being true or real, depending on your perception. They both exist in sort of correspondence or parallel with one another. And I tend to sort of, gravitate to the human story as maybe the factual story of what happens, and then Pi's animal allegory as his way of coping with that traumatic reality. So it's more of his way of understanding himself and the events, and a way of getting through something traumatic. He does that by creating this story about animals to cope with a horrible situation, a circumstance that he went through. It's also interesting at the very end when the final official report is put through by the two Japanese ministers of transport. So their story, they are reporting on the facts of what happened to the Simsum boat, why it sunk. And then at the very end, their last paragraph, as an aside, story of sole survivor Mr. Paseen Malatar Patel, Indian citizen, is an astounding story of courage and endurance in the face of extraordinarily difficult and tragic circumstances. So that is an objective truth in both stories. The fact that Pi has courage and endurance in both stories, and he has faced extraordinary, difficult, and tragic circumstances in both stories as well. So certain things are true in both. And then it says, in this experience of this investigator, his story is unparalleled in the history of shipwrecks. Very few castaways can claim to have survived so long at sea as Mr. Patel, and none in the company of an adult Bengal tiger. So they decide to report the truth, or the objective reality, as Pi surviving with the animals, rather than his more brutal story about the human survivors. So that's an interesting decision that they made, because they can't prove either one is true or not, right? Because there is no evidence to suggest that Pi didn't survive with the animals. There were even those little meerkat bones in the ship, or in the boat. So it's possible. Both are possible. But one asks us really to make a leap of faith and believe that Pi existed with animals, whereas the other one just confirms a kind of more cold, harsh reality that humans are capable of being like animals. So both stories exist within the realm of believability, but one asks us just to go a little bit further and believe in what something irrational but beautiful. The other one just confirms harsh, cold reality. So the better story is the more beautiful story, the one that has animals in it, and it confirms a kind of friendship or bond between Pi and Richard Parker, and the possibility of that existing. So it is a very challenging novel, but it asks us to sort of look beyond just the surface events, and dig deeper into deeper meanings or hidden stories or hidden truths about humans and about our main character, and also question about how we view reality and whether we're capable or not of making a leap of faith as both readers and, you know, in our own lives, in our embrace of either having faith or spirituality, or whether you are a believer of love or life or God. So it does ask us to make that leap of faith as readers.